How does a democracy work? What does that look like exactly? No one really knows the answer, and everyone has a slightly different idea. But the men in power are afraid of any opposing ideas. They refuse to listen. In fact, they make laws against this opposition. But what if you disagree with the men in power? What do you do? This is the situation in the years following the American Revolution. Democracy was being tested on the streets of Philadelphia, and it fundamentally reshaped how we run elections. More people started to vote than ever before, but that doesn't mean we had a more democratic society. This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present, because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. This episode is the second in a 4-part series about Election Day and the streets of Philadelphia. In this episode, we'll explore voting in the brand new United States in the decades following the American Revolution. I'd like to dedicate this episode to all of the people who work in the background to prepare and secure all of the polling places on Election Day. You're up early at our schools, our churches, our community centers, and you clean up after we're gone. Thank you. Throughout this mini-series, we'll be joined by Professor Mark Bruen, Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa. Professor Bruen will be our guide to the history of Election Day in Philadelphia. This series is built around his 2008 book, Celebrating Democracy, the Mass-Mediated Ritual of Election Day. His book follows Election Day activities and media coverage in Philadelphia from the colonial period to the present day. In the last episode, we looked at the huge differences between the Native American Lenape, who lived in the Philadelphia region, and the colonial government of Pennsylvania. Lenape towns were loosely affiliated with leaders chosen by a council of elders that included influential women. In contrast, the colonial settlement of Philadelphia had a rigid, male-dominated class system and a highly orchestrated Election Day ritual where only well-to-do white men could participate. And it sometimes went terribly wrong. This leads us to the events of 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and the American Revolution, which disrupted pretty much everything. Philadelphia experienced huge population swings as the British occupied the city during the winter of 1777 and then left in the spring of 1778. Residents lived through shortages of everything: food, fuel, even paper. It took years for the city and its population to rebound. But by the 1790s, Philadelphia was a hotbed of political activity. For a decade, the city served as the center of government for the city of Philadelphia, for the state of Pennsylvania, and for the fledgling government of the United States of America. Brand new federal, state, and local governments were all being worked out here. And the streets of Philadelphia became a national theater where both sides of the political debates were staged, in the form of parades, processions, bonfires, and songs. As we saw, colonial Philadelphia had hardly been a place of political harmony. But after the war, political factions began to emerge and mobilize. With the help of the wide distribution of a free press, they were all trying to figure out how this new democracy should work. First, who could vote in Philadelphia after the Revolution? In 1776 and again in 1790, Pennsylvania legislators wrote and rewrote the state constitution. Both documents reflected the Revolution's ideas of equality, at least for some. Both constitutions granted almost any free man in the state the right to vote, as long as they were a naturalized citizen, at least 20 years of age, had lived in the state for at least a year or two, and had paid tax to the state during that time. It removed the need for voters to own a certain amount of property. These broader suffrage laws extended voting rights to a much larger group of adult, mostly white men. While Pennsylvania state law did not outright ban free Black men from voting, there's no evidence that they did vote in Philadelphia during this period. And while some women briefly had the right to vote in New Jersey, that was never on the table here in Pennsylvania. So while many of the political debates of the 1790s are still relevant today, we need to remember that the majority of Philadelphia's population was excluded from the polls. After the war, people disagreed on how the country should move forward. Some men felt that the egalitarian ideas of the American Revolution went too far, while others believed they hadn't gone far enough. These fractures formed against the backdrop of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, and then there was the Haitian Revolution in 1791, all while the young country was trying to avoid getting dragged into the conflict between the world powers of France and Britain. During these troubled times, it was a major question whether members of the public could speak out against the policies decided by government when they weren't casting their vote on Election Day. Could they oppose policies they didn't agree with? And if they did oppose them, when did an act of protest become insurrection? Those who feared the radicalism of the revolution included men like George Washington and others in power, who we'll call the Federalists. They believed that political power belonged in the hands of what they called the natural aristocracy. These were elite men who were well-informed and could formulate and debate policies. The Federalists felt that they, as elected officials, represented the will of the people. The majority of eligible voters elected them, right? Therefore, whatever they did in office, within the confines of the law, was done with the approval of the majority. The public was not supposed to supervise or have input on their actions, while the elite were legislating. Thank you. See you next Election Day. On the other side were the remnants of the radicals from the Revolution, those who pushed for a more egalitarian society. We'll call them Democratic Republicans, though they had many different names. Many of these men had fought in the war. They sided with the revolutionaries in France and felt that the promises of freedom and equality of the American Revolution had not yet been met, mostly because working-class men like themselves were rarely elected to hold office. And the Democratic Republicans believed that the public could peacefully and freely express their opinion on government activities at any time, not just on Election Day. They believed that you could disagree with what the people in power did, and you could speak out about it. You could gather with like-minded individuals and pass resolutions. You could print those resolutions in a newspaper that was friendly to your ideas. You could march through the streets and sing songs. And they did so on the streets of Philadelphia. As the Democratic Republicans gathered and marched in the streets and published their opinions in the newspapers, the Federalists grew more and more afraid. They saw these democratic societies as forming a parallel government that did not represent the majority of voters and could undermine the legitimate government, just as they'd done in France. Fundamentally, the Federalists didn't believe that their young democracy could survive even peaceful political debate and competition. And this would lead to the draconian Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which were an effort to root out these Democratic Republican parties. But it was clear that at least political factions were growing and becoming more organized, and this was revealed in the growing free press of the era. During the Revolutionary War, the censored colonial newspapers of the past gave way to patriotic papers. Though these presses struggled through occupation, lack of paper, and deteriorating equipment. But in the 1790s, freed from government censorship, newspapers were on the rise. They began to grow in number and editions and in circulation. This was the start of some of the first daily newspapers. The U.S. had only 35 newspapers in 1785, but that number would grow to 1,200 over the next 50 years. And newspapers were now widely circulated between the states, thanks to the newly formed U.S. Postal Service. In 1792, it cost only a penny to send a newspaper up to 100 miles, and only 1.5 cents to send it beyond that. and printers could share their newspapers with other presses for free. There was clearly an incentive to circulate newspapers. And just consider that at the same time, it cost 6 cents to send a letter. And if you couldn't afford to subscribe to a paper yourself, newspapers from across the country were available at coffee houses, hotels, and circulating libraries. And these newspapers reflected the growing political divisions. Papers were highly biased, prioritizing their faction's political views above local happenings. Readers could choose between the staunchly Federalist Gazette of the United States or the fiercely Republican Aurora. Both were printed in Philadelphia during these years. After the war, Philadelphia voters had a new place to cast their ballots. Men no longer gathered at the city courthouse at 2nd and Market Streets. Instead, they came to what was then called the State House at 5th and Chestnut Streets, the building we now call Independence Hall. Instead of climbing the stairs, ballots were now cast from the pavement on Chestnut Street, where voters reached through the open first-floor windows and handed in their ballots to election officials stationed inside. Voters came out to the State House to vote for the governor in 1790 and for the federal Congress in 1792. Casting a vote in the new United States of America followed the traditions of the colonial era, but the act now carried a new meaning. Here's Professor Bruin to explain.
There's still a ruling group, and they're sort of still controlling a great deal of what's going on in the political world. But obviously, the ideological meaning of what you're doing with your vote has now changed radically, right? Because the voter acting in concert with other voters is establishing the legitimacy of leadership in a way that hadn't happened in the colonial period, because of this principle that it is the people's will that sort of determines the legitimacy of the political system.
Throughout this period in Philadelphia, the Federalists were in power at all levels of government, and the Democratic-Republican factions were trying to figure out what an opposition party looked like. They tried out different tactics to mobilize eligible voters, to persuade them to support their candidates, and to get out the vote on Election Day. In 1799, the Democratic Republicans deployed their get-out-the-vote strategy in the Pennsylvania governor's race, and the Federalists were forced to keep up. Both sides used a similar toolkit to persuade the voting public to cast their ballot for them. Each faction organized networks of sympathizers from the state level down to the election district. They took pains to show how their candidates had been selected by committees with statewide representation. They held public meetings across the state. These meetings often occurred on the same day as major public holidays, like July 4th, when they could gather in the streets without being accused of holding a political meeting. They drew up resolutions. Attendees were called upon to reach out to their peers and neighbors to get them to vote. They penned essays in the newspapers. And the Democratic Republicans won in 1799, with Philadelphia leaning their way. Democratic Republican candidates won the governor's seat and a majority in the State House of Representatives. And this would prove critical in 1800, when the state legislature, mired in dysfunction, ended up casting electoral votes for president. Voters in Pennsylvania didn't get a chance to cast a ballot for president that year because of the enduring weirdness of the Electoral College. But that election, in the end, culminated with the Democratic-Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson, winning the presidency, a moment that some contemporaries called the Second Revolution. But beyond winning the governor, the state house, and the presidency, Democratic Republicans had also succeeded in fundamentally reshaping American politics. Both sides now had to engage, mobilize, and activate as many voters as possible. The Democratic Republicans proved the legitimacy of such efforts. Their get-out-the-vote tactics worked. It led to higher levels of voter participation on Election Day. Voter turnout among free adult males rose from 31% in 1790 to 56% by 1799. Moving forward, all political parties would have to engage in similar get-out-the-vote tactics. All right, now let's take a look at Election Day from 1800 to the 1850s, right before the upheaval of the Civil War. During this period, Philly changed dramatically. In the early 1800s, Philadelphia was a densely settled city, with most of its population crammed into the streets close by the docks of the Delaware River. But by 1850, Philadelphia had almost filled out the blocks all the way to the Schuylkill River. This was also a huge period of economic upheaval, with the coming of the railroad and the rise of manufacturing in the city. At this point, the city was just the blocks between Vine Street on the north and South Street on the south. People living close by in Germantown, Northern Liberties, or Southwark were outside city limits. And this was an increasingly diverse group of people, with many people moving in. You had immigrants coming from Germany and Ireland, as well as Black people escaping slavery in the South, which was very close by in Delaware and Maryland. Because of this diversity, Philadelphia developed many different political factions in the early 1800s. But eventually, the Democratic Party formed around the supporters of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, and it became a dominant political force. This was the first well-organized political party, and it was built on the foundation of mobilizing popular support. The Whig Party formed in opposition with support from the middle and upper classes and evangelicals, though the Whigs tried to pretend that they weren't really a political party, just a group of patriots who hung out together. Newspapers played a huge part in fueling the political divisions in the 19th century. The newspapers of the day were outspoken partisans, staunchly behind their party. Newspapers made little attempt to remain neutral or to show different sides of an issue. The newspapers' political candidates became the embodiment of goodness and light. They were defenders of the people and democracy, while the newspapers' opposition was attacked as evil, dark, and corrupt. It was party before facts. The official definition of who could vote changed in the 1830s. That was when Black men were denied the vote in Pennsylvania, though it may not have changed who actually voted on Election Day in Philly all that much. Professor Bruin explains.
There actually was not any legal ban on Black men from voting in Pennsylvania until the 1830s. It's highly unlikely that very many, if any, Black men actually did vote in Philadelphia. In other parts of the state where levers of power were not quite so strong, it probably was the case that Black men did vote occasionally.
So why didn't Black men vote in Philadelphia? Well, when the French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville, author of Democracy in America, traveled through Philadelphia in the 1830s, he asked the same question.
In de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he observes that he doesn't see any Black men voting in Philadelphia one year when he watches Election Day take place. And his guide says they wouldn't dare do that because they'd get beaten up.
Though some Black men found a way to influence Election Day in the 1820s, the wealthy Black businessman James Forten bragged about his influence to a political candidate. Here's Professor Bruin.
Although there's also an account of one of the wealthier small businessmen who's Black, who's in Philadelphia at this time, and he runs into a candidate one day and he says, all of my working men are, what he means, all my white working men, I support you and I've told them to vote for you. So somebody like that was maybe having his workmen vote for him as a kind of a proxy.
So even though Black men didn't vote in Philadelphia, it still mattered when the Pennsylvania legislature proposed to limit the right to vote to, quote, white free men only in the new state constitution. Black Philadelphians strongly opposed this change and published an appeal of 40,000 citizens threatened with disenfranchisement to the people of Pennsylvania. It was full of data and statistics that tried to dispel racist stereotypes of Black people with hard facts. It warned that a government that deprived them of their rights to vote was a government that would likely strip others of theirs. But in 1838, white male voters ratified the new Pennsylvania Constitution with this racist language. Though it was very close, passing by just 1,000 votes. Now voters in Pennsylvania needed to be, quote, white freemen who were naturalized citizens and 21 years of age, had lived in the state for a year, and had paid some form of state or local tax within the past 2 years. Historians believe that this meant that 90% of white men could vote in Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, these men were also required to have their names on a voter registry. This was the first voter registration law in Pennsylvania, and it only applied to Philly. And people hated the registry, and it would remain on the books for only 30 years. Historians feel that the 1838 Pennsylvania Constitution changed little on the ground on Election Day. It allowed slightly more white men to vote, and black men already refused to risk their lives voting. But as an official act, it sent a strong message about who had rights and who didn't. On Election Day, economic class was erased as the dividing line between men who could vote and those who couldn't. Now race became the main difference, and black men wouldn't be able to cast a ballot in Pennsylvania until after the Civil War. So what did Election Day look like for those who could vote? For the first half of the 19th century, residents of the city of Philadelphia, which was then limited to just the area we call Center City, all voted at the same place. Voters continued to cast their ballot at the State House, or Independence Hall, at 5th and Chestnut Streets. By the early 1800s, state and federal governments had departed the State House to move to Harrisburg and D.C., so the State House was a shadow of its former self, home to a natural history museum and criminal courts. The election of inspectors now took place on a different date in September, but general elections were still held in October. Polls opened sometime between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. and stayed open until 7 or 8 in the evening. Here's Professor Bruin.
One of the first things that might start happening is you start to hear the bell from the State House. It rings all day like a church bell, calling people to come. And then people start to walk up, from various parts of the city, and they're making their way down to the State House. Probably a lot of them are stopping to have a drink or meet up with friends again before they get to the State House. There's a big crowd in front of the State House, and there are lines of men waiting to deposit their ballots. But there's also just like other things going on.
Election Day had a holiday feeling, at least for the white community. People hung flags and bunting everywhere. Banners waved across major streets. The political parties established headquarters, often in bars and taverns, and decorated the building with huge transparencies. These were the billboards of the day. They were thin canvases stretched across wood frames, hand-painted, and then lit up from behind at night. There's a famous painting titled Election Day in Philadelphia that shows the crowds on Chestnut Street in front of the State House. The painting dates to 1815, but it shows how elections might have looked throughout this period. It was painted by John Lewis Krimmel, a German immigrant, and it's currently in the collection of the Winterthur Museum. Professor Bruin describes the scene.
You've got different classes of people all throughout the street in front of the polling place. You've got people selling chestnuts or something like that, like street sellers. You've got a couple of guys that are clearly just drunk out of their gourds and they're falling down. There's a fist fight taking place to one side. There's, interestingly, this big wooden tub on wheels that's sort of going through the middle of the crowd with a flag on top, people cheering and yelling, and people sort of accosting others with tickets. Krimmel's painting includes some black people, but they're not voting. They're selling things to the people in front of the polls. So they're there, but they have no direct political role to play. So there's all of this action going on. So it's very busy. And I think it's interesting that Krimmel is the guy. He's an immigrant. So he is maybe a little bit more aware of sort of how new this sort of scene looks to other people than folks who were born in the United States and sort of take it all in stride. For him, it's worth creating a record of.
Voting in the early republic required forethought, perseverance, and physical stamina. In the confusion outside the State House, voters might be challenged. Someone might challenge your citizenship if you look like you might be a recent immigrant. Or if you looked poor, someone might ask you to prove that you'd paid state or city taxes. Newspapers told citizens to bring their naturalization papers or tax receipts with them to make sure they could vote. And then there were the citizens watching the election grounds, ready to challenge anyone who might challenge your vote. Political parties now put a great deal of effort into printing and distributing ballots that listed their selected candidates. These pre-printed ballots could now be cast as your official ballot. Now, distributing your party's tickets was seen as the key to success in an election. You wanted to maximize how many tickets your party passed out on Election Day. Though pre-printed ballots could be used to trick voters as well, newspapers warned voters to be on the alert for tickets that might look like your party's ticket, but actually list the other party's candidates. Okay, so you've made it through the crowds in front of the State House on Chestnut Street. You've got your party's pre-printed ticket. Now you have to get in line to cast your ballot at the correct window for your ward. Different wards voted at different first-floor windows of the State House. Voters stood outside and passed their ballots through the window to election officials inside. It was common for voters to face very long lines on Election Day. Voter turnout in these years averaged close to 50% in Pennsylvania. Men gathered before polls even opened, and more arrived late in the afternoon after the shops and factories closed. You'd also have to deal with gangs of young men who patrolled the windows in support of their party. If they didn't like your party affiliation, they might damage your hat, hustle you away from the window, kick you, or knock you down. Brawling at the voting window was fairly common and was generally accepted as, quote, drunken election frolics. Professor Bruin notes in his book that as late as the 1890s, a man accused of stabbing another used as his defense that the fight took place on Election Day. Come on, it was Election Day. What do you expect? This was a day of competition, of contest, even battle. So a bit of brawling was all part of the fun. And the rowdy carnival atmosphere around the State House on Election Day would spread to the rest of the city. The streets were full of political theater. Professor Bruin describes what that looked like.
One of the really interesting features of street life at this point, it's something I found in a couple of reports, were these literal moments of street theater where the characters represent ideas rather than people. So in the case of these street performances, the wooden tub is maybe called the ship of state or the good ship Freedom or something like that. And there might be a man in the middle of the boat and he's dressed up and he is the commander of the ship, the good Andrew Jackson. This would be obviously a Democratic group that would be sort of presenting this little bit of street theater, and everybody would cheer as he gets pulled through the street, and maybe he might stop in front of a pub and go into the bar and have a few drinks with folks. So there's this, the theater is sort of maybe spreading out to other parts of the city. It's still on Election Day. It's part of the election, but it's not directly part of the vote.
And Election Day celebrations continued well into the night after the polls closed. In the neighborhoods, young boys gathered wood for weeks to create huge bonfires that would be set alight on Election Day night. Unfortunately, fighting could also continue into the night. In the heavy drinking and violent years of the 1830s and 40s, elections fueled some very ugly events. In 1834, a young man was killed during the voting for election officers. In 1840, fights that broke out during voting in the general election grew into a riot in front of a tavern used as Whig headquarters. And in 1849, the young muscle hired by the Democrats to intimidate voters on Election Day got drunk that night. They gathered into a mob in front of the California House Tavern. They decided to attack the tavern over a rumor that the mixed-race owner was married to a white woman. White men targeted black men in the streets. They set fire to the tavern and then prevented firefighters from putting the fire out. Eventually, the city had to call out an armed militia to calm things down. This was the state of our democracy in Philadelphia in the years before the Civil War. Less than half of the adult population could legally vote, and those that did vote did so in a spirit of battle, which could quickly turn against those whose right to vote had been taken away. But don't worry, that's not the end of the story. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. If you're enjoying this mini-series about the history of Election Day in Philly, please get out there and vote. And please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com to learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. I want to send out a big thank you to Mark Rowan for sharing all of his expertise for this episode. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Ament. Huge thanks to the team at The Wave who mixed this episode and provided sound engineering.